Hi everyone, I'm Marianne Grimmett from Union, West Virginia. Today I'm coming to you from Douglas, Wyoming, and I will be talking to you about a specific chapter from Sacred Scripture, Sacred War by James Byrd. It'll be the chapter on David. So first of all, founding literature is replete with biblical allusions and quotations, yet many scholars fail to recognize them. And in an article entitled "The Bible and the Political Rhetoric of the American Founding," Daniel Driesbach claims that this could be due to a general lack these days of biblical literacy, particularly in familiarity with the distinct phraseology and cadences of the King James Bible. He argues that the founding generation didn't need quotation marks or citations because there was such a high biblical literacy. Similarly, in Ambiguities of Prophecy, Jonathan Keller states that the Bible accounted for approximately 1/3 of all citations in political pamphlets. In fact, 80% of political pamphlets from this area were written by ministers, with 10% of those being republished sermons. In fact, John Adams said to his wife, "The Presbyterian clergy engage in politics with a fervor that will produce wonderful effects." The clergy of many denominations was extremely important in cultivating thought and politics during the Revolutionary era. So David was especially important to clergy as they preached these messages. He was really important for patriotic ministers trying to identify the religious value of military service. So in Pulpits of Revolution, Christopher Pearl talks about how ministers of that era taught that there were limits of allegiance and we also had the right of resistance and even revolution. People had a duty to their neighbors and to God to resist government when it deviated from its proper role and devolved into corruption, confusion, and anarchy. So in Sacred Scripture, Sacred War, Byrd shows the importance of David to the revolutionary cause, particularly David as a prophet, a king, a soldier. He was the solution for the contradiction of preaching the peaceful gospel of Christ, but also preaching the necessary aggression on the battlefield. He exemplified spiritual character and military might. So first, Byrd's understanding of David the warrior. David the warrior was this underdog hero who triumphed against a mighty opponent. David was the ultimate biblical hero, not just the typical war hero. He was courageous, but his courage was actually from God and not his own. He was also the psalmist, and psalms were popular in preaching at the time because, first of all, it's the longest book of the Bible, so there's a lot of verses to pick from, and nearly everyone is familiar with them. And also many psalms address war. So David as the psalmist was pious, but also lethal. And religious men, as was preached during this time, were to be fighting men. Soldiers were never more spiritually faithful than when they were engaged in army combat for a religious cause. That was David. And also Psalm 144, according to Byrd, showed that God didn't just condone war, he empowered the soldier. God intervened in battle, he taught David to fight, and he sanctioned war and inspired violence, actually, as long as it was for a righteous cause. So David as the king, this is where it gets a little bit more complicated. David is heralded as Israel's greatest king, so he was kind of an obstacle for revolutionary patriots in overcoming the argument against monarchy. So Thomas Paine perhaps did this best in Common Sense, and he talked about how, yes, David was considered the man after God's own heart, but he was heralded as the man after God's own heart, not the king after God's own heart. And David, Bathsheba, Uriah, that whole story shows that it was David's military service that reinforced virtue and piety. His kingship actually bred corruption and laxity. So the story of David really shows how ministers of the time, they got a little creative in applying the Bible to their political and military situations. So even when David fails miserably by committing adultery and murdering Bathsheba's husband, he's still supporting the revolutionary cause by proving that monarchy would corrupt even the best of men. So in Sacred Scripture, Sacred War, James Byrd shows how David as a warrior, a psalmist, and even a king is crucial for patriotic ministers of the Revolutionary era in identifying the religious value of military service.